Upper Michigan,
1873. Wind screaming off Lake Superior, carrying ice that bit into bare skin and frosted beards white in seconds. Every settler in the township scrambled to pack mud and oakum into cabin walls. Every settler except one. A French widow knelt in her half-built house, pressing blocks of pink rock salt into raw earth where her floor would eventually rest. Neighbors gathered at the property line. They watched the way people watch something they cannot stop and do not understand. Some whispered witchcraft. Others shook their heads at a woman too stubborn to accept that she needed a man to show her how building was properly done. A widow with 2 small children, they said, ought to be thankful for offered help, not down on her knees, burying salt like some peasant, hiding riches she would never return for. She ignored them. Block after block, edge pressed tight against edge, forming a precise grid beneath her future floor. Nearly 700 pounds of rock salt dragged by ox sled from a brine works near Saginaw. Then January arrived. It arrived with fangs. The thermometer at the trading post plunged to 38 below zero. It held there 9 days without mercy. Inside the conventional cabins scattered across the township, a strange suffering took hold, one that had nothing to do with cold alone. Moisture gathered on interior walls and froze into long, glassy sheets. Blankets turned damp, then stiff with frost. Children coughed through the nights, raw, tearing coughs, born from air so dry it cracked their throats open. Meanwhile, their mothers' aprons hung rigid with frozen moisture in dark cabin corners. Wood stoves got pushed past safe limits just to chase the dampness away. The dampness always returned. But inside the French widow's cabin, the one built over buried salt, something else entirely was happening. Her floorboards held enough warmth to walk on barefoot at dawn. Her window panes showed only the thinnest lace of frost along their edges, while her neighbor's glass disappeared behind inch-thick ice. Her children slept through the night, breathing easy, and when Dr. Peaton finally rode out during the worst stretch of that bitter week, when he pressed his palm flat against her interior wall, the surface was dry, bone dry. What had this French widow grasped about salt, about moisture, about the slow and patient weight of stone, knowledge that every seasoned builder in the territory had waved away as the foolishness of a foreign woman who did not know her place? If you value stories of practical wisdom that outlasted the generations, make sure to subscribe. Your support keeps these histories alive. Margaret Boucher reached her quarter section in the spring of 1873. 2 children, a wagon load of household goods, a folded letter from the Saginaw land office that her late husband had never lived to present. Henry had died of pneumonia the previous February, 3 weeks before they were to leave their rented rooms in Quebec City for new country. Margaret made the crossing alone. 7-year-old Felix and 4-year-old Therese gripped her skirts at every river ford. She was 31, narrow through the shoulders. She carried a kind of stillness that other women read as timidity and other men read as obedience. She was neither. She had grown up along the Sagan River, where her father tended the salt evaporation pans, feeding the cod fishery downstream. Her whole childhood was salt, watching it harvested, stored, hauled, put to every use a person could devise. She understood salt the way a cooper understood oak, the way a blacksmith understood iron. She knew salt pulled moisture from the air on humid days and released it back when the air turned dry. She knew that salt blocks stored in a cold cellar through summer stayed cool to the touch long after the surrounding air had warmed. She knew the brining sheds where her father labored never sprouted the black mold that crept through ordinary storerooms, because salt itself seemed to keep the air honest. And she knew, because her grandmother had told her, that the old houses along the lower St. Lawrence once kept salt blocks beneath their hearths, to steady the heat, to balance the air, a practice that faded when iron stoves arrived, but never quite vanished from the memory of women who paid attention. Margaret paid attention. The cabin she intended to raise would be modest, 20 feet by 16, with a single sleeping loft above for the children and one main room below where she would cook, mend, and exist. She never planned to build it with her own hands alone. She hired Eli Crewwoot, a man of mixed Ojibwe and French blood, who kept a cabin 3 miles north and picked up construction work between trapping seasons. She paid him in coin she'd guarded carefully, earned from selling Henri's tools after his death. Eli was capable with wood and sparing with language. He asked nothing when she laid out her plan for a foundation unlike anything the township had seen. Not simple stone piers. She wanted a continuous, low-perimeter wall of stone, 18 inches tall. Inside that wall, the earth excavated another 6 inches down, then lined with a tight grid of salt blocks. Eli had witnessed enough oddities in his years that a French widow with unusual construction ideas barely moved the needle. He nodded once, asked how she meant to keep the salt from dissolving. That, Margaret told him, was the only question worth asking, and she had already solved it. The salt would rest on a bed of clean, dry sand, 4 inches deep, packed firm, screeded flat. Above the salt, she would lay tar paper, the roofing kind, sealed at every seam with hot pitch. Above the tar paper, a course of split cedar shakes, laid flat to create an air gap. Only then, the floorboards. The principle was straightforward, borrowed from her father's brining sheds back in Quebec City. Salt needed proximity to living space, close enough to trade moisture with cabin air through the floor, but it could never sit in liquid water, which would eat it away to nothing. The tar paper shed any groundwater that crept beneath the foundation. The cedar shakes formed a narrow ventilation channel, allowing slow vapor exchange between the salt bed and the room above. The floorboards themselves would be set with hairline gaps between them, the kind of work a careless carpenter made by accident and a skilled one made on purpose. Air would drift slowly between the storage layer and the living space. What she had designed was, at its core, a buried battery, thermal and humidity both. The salt would drink moisture when the air turned damp, release it when the air ran dry. 700 pounds of crystalline mass would hold heat from the day's fire and surrender it back through those brutal hours past midnight. And because salt itself fought mold and rot, the floor would never develop that sour stench that crept into every other cabin in the township by February. Eli grasped the whole of it by the time she finished speaking. But he told her honestly, no one else in the township would understand what she was doing, not the way he did. Margaret said she hadn't crossed into Michigan to be understood. She'd come to keep her children alive. They broke ground the second week of May. The earth had finally softened enough to dig. The black flies had just begun turning outdoor labor into punishment. The stone foundation consumed 11 days, Eli quarrying fieldstone from a glacial deposit at the back of her property, Margaret working beside him, mortaring each course with lime she'd purchased in Saginaw and slaked herself in a wooden trough. By the time the walls stood complete, 2 neighbours had already ridden over to observe and offer their opinions. The first was Cyrus Howren, who held the section to her east and fancied himself the unofficial mayor of their unincorporated township. The second was Hannah Voss, a woman whose husband had died 2 winters prior, who lived alone on a smaller claim a mile south. Hannah said almost nothing and watched everything. Cyrus said everything and watched almost nothing. "You're laying that wall too low," Cyrus informed Margaret, leaning his elbows on the top course of stone. 3 feet of stem wall at minimum, 4 if you can manage. Otherwise, snow drifts against your sills and you've got rot in the floorboards before next thaw. Margaret thanked him for his concern, asked Eli to continue working. The wall remained at 18 inches. When Cyrus returned the following week and found the trench dug inside the foundation, sand arriving by the wheelbarrow load, his tone sharpened. "What in God's creation are you doing in there, Madame Boucher? You're filling the inside of your own foundation. The floor belongs above the dirt, not buried in it." Margaret didn't bother raising her eyes from the sand she was smoothing flat. She was building the floor she intended to build. Cyrus left on horseback, grumbling about French widows who refused counsel from men who'd been working this land since before her husband had ever dreamed of proposing to her. The salt came at the tail end of June. She had placed the order through a freight broker in Saginaw. It traveled by lake schooner to a small landing along the Michigan shore, then by ox sled over the rutted wagon road that served as the township's sole thread to the outside world. 740 pounds of it, packed in oiled canvas sacks, blocks roughly the size of a man's 2 fists pressed together. Each one had been carved from a salt deposit somewhere south of the Great Lakes, then tumbled smooth across miles of freight wagons until the edges wore round and soft. The freight driver who hauled the load took one look at the cabin rising from the ground. Then he looked at the small mountain of salt sacks sitting in Margaret's barn. He asked her, not unkindly, whether she planned to start a curing operation for fish or pork. She told him the salt was going under her floor. The driver pulled off his hat, scratched his head, spoke in the voice of a man who had stopped trying to understand his customers many long years ago, said he hoped it worked out for her. Word traveled through the township inside 2 days. By the time Margaret and Eli were ready to begin setting the salt blocks, half a dozen neighbours had ridden out to witness what the French widow was up to now. Cyrus Howren brought along his brother-in-law, a man named Theodore Rusk, who had built houses across 3 separate territories and considered himself a definitive voice on cold climate construction. Theodore planted himself at the property line for close to an hour. He watched Eli and Margaret fit salt blocks into the sandbed. His face moved through several distinct expressions before landing on the one he wore when he finally opened his mouth. "Madam," he said, with the careful politeness of a man who has concluded he is addressing someone not entirely in command of her senses. "That salt will dissolve the instant groundwater touches it. Come spring thaw, you'll have brine soup beneath your floor. By next summer, rotted joists and sagging boards. I beg you, before you go one step further, let me bring a gentleman who can help you build this house the right way. The floor, my cabin, has frost on the inside walls right now. Every morning, my quilts are damp. I burn twice the wood you burn, and still it is cold, still it is wet, and my chest aches when I breathe at night. underscore underscore, quote, underscore 8, underscore underscore. I don't understand what you've done here, but it works. That is more than 2 extra cords of firewood for the season. And firewood, a man can cut himself. Salt has to be hauled from Saginaw. Winter cough. Hygroscopic regulation. The principle that certain building materials could moderate the moisture in indoor air without any active effort. He had never, he said, expected to encounter it, applied inside a frontier cabin in Upper Michigan. Built by a French widow who had absorbed the principle watching her father work a salt evaporation operation. Yet here it was, and the evidence of his own senses told him it was working remarkably well. He asked Margaret's permission to write a description of her cabin for the medical journal he subscribed to out of Detroit. Margaret told him he could write whatever he pleased. The cold broke on the 17th of January. The township began the grinding work of digging itself free and counting what had been lost. 3 families had lost animals to the freeze. 2 cabins had buckled under the weight of ice that had sat too long on their roofs. Nearly every household carried at least one person fighting a serious chest complaint. Hacking coughs, rattling lungs, full pneumonia. Dr. Peaton barely surfaced through most of February. And in the slow thaw of social life that followed the cold week, at the trading post, at Sunday gatherings, in quiet conversations where people measured their suffering against their neighbors, the talk kept drifting back to the French widow on the South Road. Her livestock had survived. Her roof had never iced over. Her children were not coughing. The laughter had died sometime around mid-January. In its place grew something careful, respectful. By the end of February, 3 settlers had come to Margaret directly, asking whether she would help them rebuild their own floors the same way. Margaret told them she would help however she could, but she was honest with them. The work could not happen in winter. The ground was locked too hard to dig. Salt, laid in freezing conditions, risked condensation. It would dissolve before the system could be properly sealed. They would have to wait for spring. Spring arrived late that year, but it arrived. The first true thaw arrived in April's 2nd week. By month's end, Margaret stood inside Cyrus Howren's cabin, helping him rip apart his own floor to lay a salt bed beneath it. Retrofitting an existing structure punished you harder than building fresh. The foundation demanded reshaping to allow for extra depth, and every plank of flooring had to come out and go back new. Cyrus, the same man who had ridden over 6 months prior to lecture her about stem wall heights. Now he knelt beside her with the quiet focus of someone who had made a decision, that learning was worth more than the pretense of already knowing. He had read the German research Dr. Patone described in those subscription journal articles the doctor passed around. He had spent the brutal tail end of winter bent over them by candlelight, asking himself one question. How much salt was he willing to buy if it meant never enduring another season like the one that had nearly broken him? The answer came back simple, as much as it took. The Howren retrofit consumed 6 full weeks. Margaret and Cyrus and his 2 sons worked through May, pushed into June. When they finished, Cyrus had nearly 900 pounds of salt beneath an expanded floor. A properly drained foundation. A tar paper and cedar layering system drawn straight from Margaret's original design. He paid her in coin and in barter, for her time, for her knowledge. And then he did something that mattered more than money. He told everyone in the township that what the French widow had built inside her own cabin was the most important piece of frontier engineering he had ever witnessed. This from Cyrus Howren, a man who had spent the previous decade believing himself the most knowledgeable builder in Saginaw. A public conversion like that does not come often. People noticed. By the end of June, 4 more families had approached Margaret for similar work. She felt it land, a quiet jolt of recognition. Without planning it, she had built herself a small business. She sat with that realization carefully. She was a widow, raising 2 young children. She held a quarter section that demanded working if she intended to keep title. There was no way to spend her summers tearing apart other people's floors, however much she wanted to help her neighbors. But she also understood something she could not ignore. What lived inside her head had value, and it could be taught. She talked it through with Hannah Voss. She talked it through with Eli Crowwoot. Eventually, she arrived at an arrangement that would shape everything that followed for her in this territory. She would consult on the design of any salt floor installation. She would charge a modest fee for her time. She would not do the physical labor herself, except on her own land. Eli, who had built her cabin and understood the system as well as anyone breathing, would take on the construction as a paid contractor. He would split a portion of his fees with Margaret in exchange for her ongoing technical guidance, and she would write up a detailed description of the entire system. Plain language, clear steps, something any literate person could follow if they chose to attempt the work without hiring help. The description would cost nothing. She refused to charge for the knowledge itself, only for her time. Only for Eli's labor. That was the arrangement. And it worked. Through the summer of 1874, Eli built or retrofitted 6 cabins with salt bed floors. Margaret consulted on every single one. She walked the property to check drainage, examined the local soil, calculated the salt load each cabin required based on size and wind exposure. The fees she earned were modest, but they were enough. Enough to hire help for spring planting on her own land. Enough to build the root cellar she had wanted from the start, but could not afford the year before. Felix and Therese grew through those warm months. Therese, who had been a thin and slightly fragile child the previous autumn, filled out into a sturdy girl who could outrun her brother on the path down to the creek. The township began to speak about Margaret differently. No one called her the French widow with the strange ideas anymore. They used a name that had grown slowly and was stronger for the slowness. Madame Boucher. Some of the older settlers, the ones who still remembered their own grandmother's wisdom and had watched it get shouldered aside by the rush of the frontier, began bringing her other half-forgotten knowledge. An old Cornish woman, living 2 townships away, sent Margaret a letter. She had heard about the salt floor from a traveling minister and wanted to know whether Margaret was familiar with the lime and clay floors of her own childhood. Different materials, similar results. Margaret wrote back. The 2 women kept writing to each other for years. The second winter, 1874 into 75, came in gentler than the first. Still a real winter. Still cold enough to test everything. By then, 6 cabins in the township had salt bed floors. Cyrus Howren's, Hannah Voss's, 4 others. Dr. Peaton watched all 6 with the quiet intensity of a man who had found his subject. He had ordered a small brass instrument from Detroit for measuring indoor temperature and humidity. That winter, he carried it into every cabin he entered. He recorded everything. What he sent to the Detroit Medical Journal in March of '75 told a clear story. The salt floor cabins held indoor relative humidity between 38 and 52% across the entire winter. Almost no swing from day to day. The conventional cabins in the same township were a different world. 12% humidity on the dry end. Cabins where the stove roared all day. 94% on the damp end. Cabins sweating with condensation. The respiratory complaints Dr. Peaton treated that season fell along those same lines almost perfectly. Residents of salt floor cabins barely coughed all winter. Residents of conventional cabins coughed constantly. His report concluded that the principles Madame Boucher was applying aligned with German hygroscopic research and with traditional building practices once common in coastal Quebec. The practical implications for frontier health, he wrote, were considerable. 2 other regional medical journals reprinted the article within the following year. Then the letters started arriving at Margaret's cabin. Settlers from Wisconsin, Minnesota, Northern Ontario, all of them asking for her detailed plans. Margaret sent every set of plans free of charge. Her only request, write back with your results. Most of them did. Through the late 70s, her correspondence file thickened into a small archive of frontier building knowledge. Dozens of cabins reported back on their first and second winters. Some had trouble, usually poor drainage, sometimes salt contaminated with other minerals during shipping. Margaret answered every letter with advice tailored to that specific problem. And the network of salt floor cabins spread slowly across the upper Midwest. The mechanism behind it all, Margaret herself never described it in scientific language. She did not think in scientific language. She thought the way her father had thought, the way her grandmother had thought, in practical terms. She knew salt held moisture and released it. She knew stone mass, any mass, held heat and released it. She knew her floor married those 2 principles in a single layer that worked without asking anything of her. The full scientific explanation, as Dr. Peaton eventually came to grasp, and as later generations of building scientists would confirm, rested on 2 interlocking effects. The first was thermal mass. 700 pounds of crystallized salt beneath the floor of a small cabin formed a substantial heat reservoir. During the day, as the wood stove warmed the cabin, some of that warmth traveled downward, through the floorboards, through the cedar shakes, through the tar paper, into the salt, which absorbed it and held it. At night, as the cabin cooled, the salt gave that heat back, slowly, steadily. The result was a flattening of the daily temperature swing. A cabin without thermal mass plunged toward freezing within hours of the fire being banked. A cabin sitting on significant thermal mass cooled gradually over many hours. The people inside could sleep through the night with a small banked fire, a fire that would never have been enough in a structure with less mass beneath it. The second effect was hygroscopic regulation. Salt has a particular relationship with water vapor. That relationship shifts depending on the relative humidity of the surrounding air. Below a certain critical threshold, salt grips the moisture it has absorbed and surrenders it only slowly. Above that threshold, salt pulls water from the air with startling force. For sodium chloride, the critical point hovers near 75% relative humidity at ordinary room temperatures. What this meant inside Margaret's cabin, and inside every cabin built after her design, was something elegant in its simplicity. When indoor humidity climbed above the comfortable middle range, maybe from a pot boiling on the stove, maybe from 6 people breathing around a supper table, maybe from soaked boots steaming by the door, the salt beneath the floorboards drank the excess. When humidity dropped below that range, maybe from a roaring fire pulling moisture from the air, maybe from bitter cold seeping through gaps around the frame, the salt gave its moisture back. Slowly, steadily. No thermostat, no human hand required, no machinery of any kind. It just worked, all winter long. Because salt crystals near water vapor obey the same physical chemistry they have obeyed for millennia. These two effects together delivered exactly what Margaret had chased from the start. Her cabin held its heat. Floor surfaces did not plummet at night, did not spike during the day. The humidity stayed where human lungs want it, where skin stops cracking and breathing stops hurting. Mold never took hold because the salt itself poisoned microbial growth in that layer just beneath the boards. The bone-dry misery of overheated cabins never appeared either, because the salt always carried moisture it could surrender back into the room. Firewood lasted longer. The thermal mass meant the stove was not fighting a losing battle against nighttime cold, and the people inside stayed healthier. Month after month, through the darkest stretch of winter, they breathed air that human bodies were built to breathe. Not parched, not sodden, not dead still, not raw with wind. By 1878, 23 cabins in the township had salt bed floors, out of perhaps 60 households total. Margaret was 36, financially stable for the first time in her grown life. Known across the upper Great Lakes as the woman who carried old French knowledge into country that had been desperate for it. She never remarried. 2 men courted her respectfully over the years. She turned them both away with the same quiet grace she had once used to thank Theodore Rusk for his concern. She was content with her life as it stood. She raised her children. She wrote letters to a growing circle of salt floor builders scattered across the territory. She lived. She worked. She aged into the kind of still authority that frontier communities sometimes granted to women who had earned it through their hands and their choices. Felix grew into a carpenter. Eventually, he took over Eli Crowwood's operation when Eli's body could no longer bear the heavy work. Terry's became a schoolteacher first. Then, to her mother's quiet, fierce pride, a nurse, working beside Dr. Peaton's successor in the township's small medical practice. The salt floors endured. Cabins raised in the 1870s, properly built and reasonably maintained, still performed well into the 1900s. Some outlasted their original owners by 2 full generations. Tracing the broader history of the salt floor system is harder than tracing the history of Margaret's own cabin. The practice moved through informal channels, not institutions. Settler wrote to settler, builder taught builder. The technique surfaced in slightly altered forms in cabins as far west as the Dakotas and as far north as the Saskatchewan River by the 1890s. Sometimes it traveled carrying Margaret's name, the French widow with the salt beneath her floor. Sometimes it arrived as nameless knowledge, picked up somewhere along the way and reshaped for local ground and local weather. The Pennsylvania Germans, who kept their own traditions of salt in root cellars and curing rooms, occasionally claimed the salt floor system as part of their own folk wisdom. They may well have had separate origins for it, traditions that grew alongside Margaret's work rather than from it. Building historians who've dug into the question found that several separate traditions of using salt as a hygroscopic and thermal regulator existed across North America. These traditions rose and fell and rose again. Rediscovered each time, a brutal winter forced settlers to rethink everything they thought they knew about keeping walls dry and rooms warm. Modern building science has since confirmed with laboratory precision and computer modeling what Margaret figured out by watching her father's salt sheds. Hygroscopic materials in the building envelope produce measurable gains in indoor air quality, comfort, and energy performance. Salt blocks, placed in the right climate, perform within a few percentage points of the theoretical ideal for passive humidity control. The German research Dr. Peeten had read about in the 1870s continued, refined, expanded by generations of building physicists. The core conclusions never changed. Salt works, stone mass works. Together, they outperform either one alone. None of this would have surprised Madame Boucher, though the granularity of modern measurements would probably have struck her as faintly absurd. She had been, when everything was stripped away, a practical woman trying to keep her children alive through a frontier winter. She used what she knew, and what she knew turned out to be right, at a time when more than a few seasoned builders in her township had been wrong. That was the kind of vindication a woman could lean on when neighbors needed reminding that wisdom did not always wear a beard or swing a hammer. The story of Margaret Boucher survives in fragments: township records, family letters, the medical journal articles Dr. Patone published in the 1870s. No single comprehensive biography exists. She never chased recognition, would likely have bristled at the thought of being singled out for remembrance. But the cabins she helped design still stand in some cases, weathered, altered, yet unmistakable to anyone who knows the signs. The principle she brought into that township is taught now in courses on traditional building methods, in workshops on passive house design, in historical preservation programs that take seriously a stubborn truth. Our ancestors understood things we've spent decades relearning. And every so often, in a cold cabin somewhere across the Great Lakes region, a homeowner pulls up old floorboards to fix a joist. Beneath the tar paper, beneath the cedar shakes, beneath layers of accumulated dust, a grid of pinkish stone blocks set in clean, dry sand. The homeowner stares, doesn't know what they're seeing. Sometimes they call a local historian, a building inspector, the ones who've been around long enough to recognize that pattern. They smile. They know exactly what's buried under that floor. They know who placed it there. And they know, even if the homeowner doesn't yet, that the cabin beneath their feet has been quietly doing its work for 150 years, holding warmth through frozen nights, balancing moisture through bone-dry days, all by virtue of a French widow who listened to her father and her grandmother, and who refused, in the spring of 1873, to let anyone talk her out of the floor she intended to build. Margaret Boucher died in 1906. She was 64. She died in the cabin she and Eli Crerute had raised together 33 years before. The salt beneath her floor was still working the day she closed her eyes. Her son Felix stood at her bedside, her daughter Therese beside him. And Ruth, Hannah Voss's daughter, who had spent a lifetime calling Margaret aunt, was there too. The cabin was warm. The air held steady, not too dry, not too damp. The thermometer nailed to the inside of the front door read 62 degrees. Outside, on that same January morning, it was 19 below zero. The local paper ran a small obituary. It mentioned her late husband Henri, her children, her work as a builder's consultant. the unusual cabin she had constructed in her first year in the township. The obituary said nothing about the salt directly. It didn't need to. Everyone in that township already knew. Every soul in that township understood something plain. The woman they laid to rest that week had transformed how people raised houses in their stretch of country. She had likely kept more families alive through bitter winters than anyone cared to count. And she had done all of it without ever lifting her voice, without ever asking for a single word of thanks. If you have stayed until now, it is because stories built from this kind of quiet, stubborn wisdom still mean something to you. That is rarer than you know. So if this account stayed with you, if it settled somewhere beneath the surface, consider subscribing and leaving a comment with your city and the hour you watched. We read every one. Your voice helps us keep unearthing these histories of patient, practical knowledge, the kind our great-grandparents carried in their hands without thinking, the kind we are only now learning to remember. Like the video if it lived in you after it ended. Send it to someone who would understand. We will return with another documented account worth preserving.